Welcome back, I'm Izzy at Minerva. We are continuing our coat block pattern drafting series. Over the last 2 weeks we've looked at how to draft our own coat, back and front, and then we've also looked at how to draft a two-piece sleeve. In this video now we're going to talk about how to use those blocks to create pattern pieces and then how to sew them together nicely and accurately. And I will actually make my own as well so you can see what it looks like. Now the fit alterations for the coat block will be very similar to the fit alterations for the dress and the bodice, so do go back and refer to those videos that we've filmed previously for you, as those will be really informative in refining the fit of your coat block after today's video. In today's video I'm actually wearing a self-drafted dress which I drafted using my dress block, which I've shown you how to do a number of videos ago now. This is in our Minerva exclusive viscose linen fabric in pebble stone pattern. Very cute and really sweet, really simple to draft. So yeah, definitely loads of fun. I absolutely love pattern drafting. So that's what I'm wearing today. Let's get straight on into it now in terms of creating our pattern pieces. As you follow along today, you're going to need your standard pattern drafting tools, and those are listed next to me here as usual. So take a look at those and make sure you've got them and are ready to start. It's worth saying before we start this process that we are doing a toile, and so I'm only going to add seam allowances to parts of the block which are going to be sewn to something else. So I'm not going to be adding a seam allowance to the neckline or to the hem, simply because I'm not finishing the garment. All I'm doing is I am making a block which I am then creating a pattern out of to check the fit. So there's no point in doing additional work in terms of designing facings and doing all of that structural work if the actual fit of the block isn't going to work. So that's what we're going to do today. We're just making a nice little toile. Okay, so in front of me here we have got my coat block. This is my front and the back. I've covered it with some tracing paper, and we're just going to add a 1.5cm seam allowance around the majority of the block. When you're creating coat pattern pieces, there are a number of different methods you can do, and there are also different types of seam allowances that you can add to different parts of the coat. For the sake of simplicity, we are just going to add our standard seam allowance where a seam is required. Let's start at the back. Our back pattern piece is actually just going to be cut on the fold. So just draw a line straight down from the nape to the hip. Now I'm actually just going to extend my hip line by 10 centimetres just to give me a little bit of extra volume as I check the fit for the garment. So I can really check when I'm sitting down if it's giving me the ease that I need. Excellent, just draw a straight hemline. Add a 1.5cm seam allowance to the side seam. Don't forget you've got these handy little red dots on your pattern drafting ruler, which are really helpful. We're going to do the arm side next, and it's a curve, so it's a bit awkward to get our seam allowance accurate. So all I'm going to do is I'm just going to dot it out, 1.5cm seam allowance all the way around the perimeter of the curve of the arm side. And once you've dotted it out, I'm just going to draw it in. Draw a 1.5cm seam allowance to the shoulder. And then, as mentioned earlier, we're not going to add a seam allowance to the neckline. We're just checking fit around there for this toile. Okay, so we've added the seam allowance to the back pattern piece. In order to get a nice accurate fit, I'm also going to add a stitch line to where the actual block lines are. So in a nice dashed pen line, I'm just going to draw over all of the lines of the block onto my pattern piece. And that's just going to help me sew and pin really accurately when I come to make my toile. And then I want to add some sort of standard annotation. So I want to know where my back pitch point is. And for our pattern pieces, we always put a double notch on the back. So although we've only got one notch on our block, we're just going to put another one 5mm below, and that's going to be really nice and accurate and clear there. I'm also going to add a dashed line for where my waist and hips are. The reason why I'm doing this is so that I can check the balance of the coat once I've got the toile on. And by the balance I just mean sort of how it's hanging, if it's going up on at the front or up at the back, or yeah, just how it's sitting on my body in relation to the floor. So these lines should run parallel to the floor when you've got the garment on. And don't forget, we've got some great little fit videos on our YouTube channel for you to be able to check. Okay, annotate your pattern piece next. We need to know how we're going to cut this pattern. So we need to say that we're going to place the centre back on the fold. Now we also need to know where the grain line needs to run on the pattern. So the grain line runs parallel to the selvage, so the edge of the fabric as it's put on the loom. And what we want is for the grain line to follow our centre back for our pattern piece. So this is our centre back, so we're just going to draw a line that is parallel to the centre back like this, and just annotate it with a little arrow at the top and the bottom and say it's our grain line. I'm also just going to annotate this for clarity, although that's the hip, that's the waist, and this is the bust. And then finally, we need to actually annotate the pattern piece and say what it is. Now, I'm going to say that this one is our coat block back. Cut 1 on fold. And then I also want to make sure that I'm referencing on this pattern piece which toile this is. So I might put my name and the date on this pattern piece as well, because if you do a number of these, it's really easy to get confused as to which one is the most up to date. So I might just put toile 1 for this one. Okay, great. We're just going to repeat that whole process for the front now. Add your 1.5 centimetre seam allowance to the length of the side seam, and then extend the hem of the garment by 10 centimetres. Down the centre front, I'm just going to add my standard 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. The neckline is not going to have a seam allowance, so just draw that straight in. To the top of the shoulder, just dot it out as we did for the armscye, because it's got a bit of a curve on it, hasn't it? Draw in your dart legs, extending them 1.5 centimetres above the top at the shoulder, and then just add that 1.5 centimetre seam allowance to the top there. That's just going to help you as you sew it together later. Dot out your 1.5 centimetre seam allowance around the sleeve, around the armscye, and then just draw it in. As we did for the back, let's now add in our little stitch lines. So the shoulder stitch lines will be our starting point. We're just going to freestyle draw those because it's a nice little curve. Same on the armscye, and then your side seam. Now we do need to dot out our stitch line on our centre front. This is not actually going to be a stitch line because we're just going to pin it down the front once we try it on. Draw in your balance lines of your hip, waist, and bust. And where your front pitch point is, just put one little notch there. Brilliant. So the only thing left to do now is just to annotate as we did with the front. So let's annotate this line to say bust, waist, and hips. We don't need to add anything to say cut on the fold because we're not, but our grain line is going to run parallel to our centre front. This is our coat block front, and we're going to cut 2, and it is our toile number 1. Excellent. That is our front and our back done now. Let's move on to our sleeve pattern pieces. Okay, with our sleeve pattern piece now, we've got 2 sleeve parts. This is obviously a 2-piece sleeve. So I'm going to draw around the top sleeve to start off with. There is going to be no seam allowance to the bottom, simply because we are checking fit and it's not being attached to anything else. Dot out the 1.5 centimetre seam allowance to the curve of this outer seam here, and then just draw in a nice curve. Dot out the curve to the sleeve head as well, just in a similar way, and then just draw it in. And then for our other curve down here, we're just going to dot it out again first. Lots of curves, aren't there, with this pattern piece? So just keep going. Obviously at home you should be using a nice sharp pencil to do this and get it as accurate as possible. Okay, as we did for the back and the front pattern piece, I'm going to now dash out the stitch lines. So I'm getting the pattern piece as accurate as possible. Okay, let's just add some little help points. I'm just going to annotate and do a little notch along the elbow line at the sides. That's going to be a nice reference when we sew the two together. And then the grain line runs perpendicular to your elbow line for this pattern piece. And then just annotate. Two-piece sleeve, top sleeve, cut 2, toile 1. Great, let's move on now to the underarm and create that pattern piece in exactly the same way. Okay, so we're working with this smaller pattern piece here. So we're just going to do it in exactly the same way we did for the other one. Now up here and here, you'll notice that we could just sort of continue to extend that out, but it would just be a really weird pattern piece, wouldn't it? So what we tend to do at this sort of junction is just give ourselves a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance from the point at that point, and then literally just draw it off like that. And the same on the top up here. Once you've done that, just dot out your stitch lines. And you'll notice that we've not done a hem to the bottom in exactly the same way as we did for the top sleeve. Let's add our little elbow notches now. And then our grain line runs perpendicular to the elbow line. This is our two-piece sleeve. Our undersleeve, we're going to cut 2, and this is toile. This is toile 1. Okay, brilliant. We've done everything we need to for that now. It's now a case of grabbing your fabric and very carefully cutting out these pattern pieces as accurately as you can. And then I'll show you how to transfer the line markings at the stitch lines using carbon paper before we sew it up together. Once you've cut out your pattern pieces, we then just need to transfer our stitch lines and these markings to the bust, waist and hips for all of our pattern pieces. So the first thing I'm going to do is cut into these little notches here and do a nice little double notch. And I'm only cutting in about 5mm, half a centimetre in. That just creates a nice little cut in the fabric there. The next thing I'm going to do is grab my pattern tracing wheel and some carbon paper. Now I've got a really large strip of carbon paper here. I'm going to fold it in half so that I've got the red on both sides. Then I'm just going to unpin carefully one side of my pattern piece. Now obviously this one is cut on the fold, isn't it? Up here you can see that. Then I'm going to just pull away the top layer of fabric and the pattern piece, and then slide the carbon paper in between both of the pieces of fabric. Okay, then just using our tracing wheel, I'm just going to trace over each one of those lines, starting off with the bust line, pressing down nice and hard, then the waist and the hips. And then your stitch line is going to be really helpful to do as well. Perfect, great. Okay, let's take a look and see what that looks like now. So when I open out the pattern piece, this is the back of the coat, you can see that I've got all the lines and the stitch lines transferred beautifully onto my pattern piece. Let's just take a closer look at what that looks like. Repeat that process for all of the pattern pieces. So now that we've got the carbon paper line markings onto our pattern piece, the next thing we're going to do is just sew a line of basting stitches along the hip, waist and the bust line, and this is just going to be a line of stitches that runs straight along those lines, and it's just going to help us assess the fit when we finished sewing our toile. Brilliant! Once you've done that, you've done all the prep you need to for the back pattern piece. And then just repeat that process of sewing in your hip, waist and bust lines for the front pattern piece as well. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to sew these darts together. Now we're going to pinch the fabric so that the two lines of dots, both these two lines here, line up beautifully. So starting at the top, put a pin in that is lining up exactly with your dotted carbon paper line. Turn it over and just check to see if it's tying in with the dotted line on that side, which it is, and then just continue down the rest of the dart, adjusting the fabric as you need to, and then just checking it to make sure that it's pinned through on both sides nicely and accurately. Beautiful. Okay, so next what we're going to do is we are going to sew this dart. Now in order to sew it nice and neatly, we're going to sew it up here, reinforce the stitch line up here using a standard stitch length, then sew all the way down as we get to about 5 centimeters below the finish point. We're then going to start to reduce our stitch length so that the stitches get smaller and tighter, like shorter and shorter, and then we're just going to sew off the end, leaving a strand, 2 strands of thread, and then just tie them together in a knot. That prevents there being a lot of bulk at the end down there, so that it looks like that. And on both sides you can see the stitch line is just coming down nicely, lining up with that carbon paper. Tie a knot at the end of the dart. And then the next thing to do is just to press that dart towards the side. Repeat that process with the other pattern piece. Next, take the back pattern piece with right sides facing up, and then put the front pattern pieces on top of it with right sides together. We're then going to pin the side seams together. Now we have got down here the hip lines which we can match up, and what we're trying to do is just pop a pin through the carbon paper line on one side and through the carbon paper like marking lines on the other side, and then we just want to pin it in the direction that we're going to be sewing it. So what we're checking is that the pin is going through the carbon paper dot lines on either side of the fabric because we've got it together. So pin the hip first, and then let's do the waist line and just pin it in place. That's great. And then do the underarm or bust line here. Okay, brilliant. And once they're both done, we'll then pin the shoulder seams as well. Now don't forget that you've got a curve on the front pattern piece, which then is aligning with a straight line on the back. So just be really careful to make sure that the pin is definitely going through both sides of the carbon paper. So you might just have to ease that in slightly. Excellent. Once you've done one shoulder, just repeat the process for the other one. Brilliant. Okay, so now that we've done that, we can then just sew those seams, and we're going to use a basting stitch length so we can easily unpick it if we need to. So we can use a long stitch length of 4.5 or 5 mil long to sew all of those seams. Excellent. And once you've sewn all those 4 side seams, I'm just going to press open the seams just to get them really nice and flat everywhere. Okay, moving on to our sleeve pattern pieces. If there was any doubt about what is happening on this sleeve, this bit here is the front. That's obviously the top of the head is where the shoulders are, but we'll mark on where that notch is once we've tried it on, and we can check that. And then this seam ties in with this one here because it's the longer one, and that one obviously ties in with that one because it's the shorter one. So this is the back effectively over here. Okay, so let's start to sew our sleeves together. Okay, so with right sides together, put the underarm sleeve over the top sleeve, and then just pin down the side seam. And then just sew that seam. Okay, at this point you can either press that seam open once you've sewn it, or you can press it towards the underarm, the smaller one there. Okay, and once that's done, again, right sides together, we're then going to do and pin this long edge. Don't forget that you've got the little elbow notches if you need them, just to help you sort of locate where things need to be. As usual with the series, as I'm sewing, I'm using contrasting thread just so you can see it really clearly on the screen above. It also makes unpicking easier as well, if necessary, as you're doing the fit. So that's another good reason to use a contrasting thread. Obviously it doesn't look as beautiful, but it's still worth doing. And then just sew that together. And then just press that seam. Okay, we're now going to attach the sleeve into the coat. So make sure you know which is the front and which is the back of your sleeve. And we're actually going to line up the seam with the notch that we've got on the back to start off with. And then I'm just going to bring, so this is right sides together, bring the other side up and match that with the notch up here. So that's that seam with that notch there. And that's just like a holding point, kind of just to start off with while I get everything else sorted. Lovely. So now we should be able to just pin nice and neatly around between those two pins, which is basically the underarm seam. And again, you've got these lovely helpful little carbon paper dotted lines, which are just going to help you make sure that you're sewing it exactly at 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. So at this point, just pin really neatly all the way around. Now at that point, I would recommend just sewing along there, simply because it then simplifies the process of fitting the sleeve head into the main body of the garment in a little while. Okay, right, what we're going to do now is we're going to fit the rest of the sleeve head into the arm side here. I'm actually going to flip it inside out like that, and then I'm just going to pull that sleeve head up into the arm side. And basically what I want to do is evenly distribute the sleeve head into this arm side. We want more of more of the sleeve head to be fitted into the back to give us a bit more ease around the sleeve head at the back, and then we want less at the front. So really it's just a matter of pinning it and easing the volume, the excess volume in between. Okay, once your sleeve is pinned all the way around from one notch all the way to the other, that's when we're going to sew it, and all we're going to do is just baste it in place. We've got this lovely dotted red line from our carbon paper that we can follow as we sew around the sleeve head. Now we are going to baste it. You could hand stitch this if you wanted to get a really nice neat finish. And as you can see, we have got a lot of pins in, and we are easing in around the back quite significantly. So around the back we're easing in around here quite a lot, as in there's a lot more of the sleeve head fitting into the arm side than there is at the front. So let's go and sew this now. Excellent. Once you've sewn one sleeve in, we're then going to move on and repeat the process for the other sleeve, and then we can try it on for fit. Okay, so here is our coat block. It's looking really good. It's a brilliant start, and obviously there may be some areas where you just want to refine the fit further, and that's absolutely fine. Don't forget that you can refer to our previous videos that we filmed in relation to the fit of the bodice and the dress and the skirt, all those sorts of hips and bust and waist and balance points and shoulders and moving seams at the shoulder seams and all that sort of stuff. So refer back to those videos if you need further support in terms of fitting your coat block. And so next week, come back and join me, and I'll be showing you how to use your block, your coat block, to create a few different types of coat styles. This is going to be really fun and a great way to start exploring how to use our coat block. So thank you for joining me today. I will see you next week.